36,400,000. That's the expected number of intelligent civilizations in our galaxy, according to Drake's famous equation. For the last 78 years, we'd been broadcasting everything about us. Our radio, our television, our history, our greatest discoveries to the rest of the galaxy. We'd been shouting our existence at the top of our lungs to the rest of the universe, wondering if we were alone. 36 million civilizations. Yet, in almost a century of listening, we hadn't heard a thing. We were alone. That was until about 5 minutes ago. The transmission came on every transcendental multiple of hydrogen's frequency that we were listening to. Transcendental harmonics, things like hydrogen's frequency times pi, don't appear in nature, so I knew it had to be artificial. The signal pushed on and off very quickly with incredibly uniform amplitudes. My initial reaction was that this was some sort of binary transmission. I measured 1,679 pulses in the 1 minute that the transmission was active. After that, the silence resumed. The numbers didn't make any sense at first. They just seemed to be a random jumble of noise. But the pulses were so perfectly uniform, and on a frequency that was always so silent. They had to come from an artificial source. I looked over the transmission again, and my heart skipped a beat. 1,679. That was the exact length of the Arecibo message sent about 40 years ago. I excitedly started arranging the bits in the original 73 by 23 rectangle. I didn't get halfway through before my hopes were confirmed. This was the exact same message. The numbers in binary from 1 to 10. The atomic numbers of the elements that make up life. The formulas for our DNA nucleotides. Someone had been listening to us and wanted us to know they were there. Then it came to me. This original message was transmitted only 40 years ago. This means that life must be at most 20 light years away, a civilization within talking distance. This would revolutionize every field I have ever worked in. Astrophysics, astrobiology, The signal is beeping again. This time it's slow, deliberate even. It lasts just under 5 minutes, with a new bit coming in once per second. Though the computers are of course recording it, I start writing them down. 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. I knew immediately this wasn't the same message as before. My mind races through all the possibilities of what this could be. The transmission ends, having transmitted 248 bits. Surely this is too small for a meaningful message. What great message to another civilization could you possibly send with only 248 bits of information? On a computer, the only files that small would be limited to text. Was it possible? Were they really sending a message to us in our own language? Come to think of it, it's not that out of the question. We had been transmitting pretty much every language on Earth for the last 70 years. I began to decipher with the first encoding scheme I could think of. ASCII. 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. That's B. 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, E. As I finish piecing together the message, my stomach sinks like an anchor. The words before me answer everything. Be quiet, or they will hear you. It's been 2 weeks since this whole thing started. It began with a tanker accident. It was all over the news. Everyone thought it was just an oil spill. There were plenty of volunteers, kind people wanting to help the poor, defenseless animals. Lots of victims. Within hours of the accident, it started happening. The animals had gone crazy. There was scratching and biting the cleanup volunteers. People said it was an adverse effect to whatever was in the tanker. Rescue workers were still trying to get the crew out of the ship. They could hear yelling inside, fierce demands to be let out. But that's when it all went to hell. As soon as they cut the door open, There were 6 minutes of broadcast before it went silent. 6 minutes of screaming and agony. The ship crew attacked the rescue workers like rabid baboons. They were breaking bones and tearing flesh. The people on the shore weren't faring any better. Those that had been attacked by the animals were attacking everyone else. It was worse than any war zone report. It was sheer brutality. And yet the broadcast went on for 6 whole minutes. Blank faces followed. Nobody could explain what was happening. They tried to continue with the regular news, the economy, the weather, and a cute human interest story. But they couldn't make us unsee what we saw. I tried to get on with my regular existence. But every time I switched on the news or walked by a paper stand, it was there, this big mystery. They had some explanations, bacteria or maybe brain parasites, but it didn't matter. It wasn't the infection we were afraid of. It was them. 4 days after the initial report, a state of emergency was raised, and yet, we'd all seen this before. It's in every zombie movie ever made. People didn't know who to trust, so we were stockpiling food and weapons. Some tried to flee, but it seemed that every zombie movie was right. They didn't make it. 3 days later, they arrived in my town, and I expected moans, shuffling corpses, and dismemberment. But that's where the movies lied. They ran through the street screaming. I remember sprinting to my front door as fast as I could, locking and barricading it, doing anything to make sure it would stay shut. Then I headed for the window. I was on the 2nd story, and I could see the carnage. They were unstoppable. They were aware. A group of them made their way through a building across the street. They jumped straight through the plate glass windows like they were nothing. The shards slicing through their skin made no difference. They just kept coming. My barricade wasn't going to hold. I rushed from my flat, grabbing supplies and throwing them into the most secure room. I went back for one last look across the street, and I wish I hadn't. In a 2nd story window, my face met with one of theirs. They knew where I was. I quickly dashed into the room and locked the door. I don't have any kind of panic room or a secure basement. So the safest place I could think of was my bathroom. There were no windows and only one door with a lock. I filled my sink and bathtub full of water so I could stay there for a while and sat in the dark. Distant screams in my ears. I began to feel like I may have overreacted. It had been 2 hours with no sign of any zombies. It actually got quieter, and I thought they may have moved on. Maybe I could leave the room and get to the kitchen. I could grab some more food to wait this whole thing out. A crash came from the front door. It was the sound of someone running into it full force, knocking down the barricade I'd put up. There were a couple more crashes before I knew they were inside. I heard rapid footsteps moving around the flat, more screams, and then a loud bang on the wall beside me. My eyes were open to their widest, even in the pitch darkness of the room. There was another bang, and another. They knew I was there, and they knew I was scared. This was the zombie nightmare I had been expecting from the start. I had nowhere to run. There was only so much time before they would break in. I sat with my back to the door, hoping my extra weight would make it harder for them to knock it down. Then it got worse. "Why don't you open the door?" There was a voice from outside. No screams or moans, just a quiet, whispery voice. And then more of them. "We've come for you. You'll be happier if you open the door. It's not so bad." The whispery voices became a cacophony of noise, trying to persuade me, to break me, to fool me. I had heard that the moaning of the zombies would drive people insane. But this was worse. A siren call. I sat in the darkness and hoped and prayed that they'd get bored. But the undead don't get bored. And they don't leave. I managed to use the mirror to peek under the door, only to be greeted by horrible, unblinking eyes, blood-smeared faces, screams, and more horrible whispers. That was 2 days ago. I don't know what to do anymore. Maybe it won't be so bad. If someone is to read these bloodied parchments of mine, I sincerely hope that in finding these final sentiments, you yourself have not fallen into the same treacherous despair as I have. I deter anyone from investigating further, for I do not wish to be liable for anyone's psychological break and subsequent demise. I suppose context is necessary. I worked as an embalmer. I had always had an acute fascination with the dead. I suppose this originates from a life of indifference, which is to say that I had not longed for the human spirit. Such an occupation originally appealed to my Puritan ideals, viewing such bereaved ones as being of the utmost purity, comparable to that of a newborn child. I confess, I longed for something more. This desire was perhaps the spark in which I would be inducted into a process of social delineation and inherently superfluous curiosity, spurred by singularity, a pale, archaic star. It was around June when an unidentified corpse had been uncovered from a nearby sewer tract. That night I recall a cascading downpour that seemed to span centuries, whereas on that night, the sight that befell my gaze in the morgue was one that I had not seen before. For this was the particular moment when a morbid intrigue took hold of me. A beached carcass watched up from the impervious deep of the great blue. It was the kind of sight that left one disconcerted, without reason. The very thing that eroded my self-agency, which had previously comforted me in my endeavours. I felt my curiosity at this moment could not be satiated, even if I were to scour every inch of the cavernous sewers in which it originated. One can infer that the man, for he was discernibly male, that lay in front of me had once been an intimidating figure. His frame was quite large, not to the extent of, say, a bodybuilder, but possessing the general physique that was proportionate to his bulking 6 feet 8-inch build. He sported oily, undulating locks of black hair as well as a dense and unkempt beard that had been ravaged by vermin, complementing his pallid and immovable countenance, of which he seemed to be in a nocturnal slumber. Muscular atrophy had extended itself to each bilateral muscle, being most outwardly predominant in the pectoral and dorsal muscles. A sporadic rot had sullied every inch of his corpse with multiple abrasions lining his body. His skin took on a fetid, repulsive quality, and embalming fluid seemed futile in this stage of decomposition, left in the wake of arrant abhorrence. What was left of his gravelous face may indicate a man who had monstrous deformities, one that can be said to be similar in its elongated and retarding form to that of a Neanderthal. The identifiable characteristics of this man had inevitably become indiscernible amidst the bile and grot that he had accumulated onto his rotting flesh, accentuating his protruding features, as if he had lived the remainder of his days in a forlorn mould of himself, irreversible from years of living as a troglodyte. I stared into his lost, wistful gaze, hoping to find some sign of humanity. I was met with anything but, bereft of anything at all humane. What stared back at me was a creature of pure carnality. It felt as if he followed my every move with a reverse judgment, for I was to him but another feeble observer. He seemed to be a relic of an era long gone, some kind of artifact that had been confounded by modernity. His body had so deeply engrossed itself in its own sickness that the burden of such lonely ideals seemed tame in comparison. I saw in those very moments a symbolic gesturing of the present for a descendants in which I wasn't entirely sure he had any connection to. This man felt like an unseen parish of an unworldly form, one who'd coddled with the impossibilities of human nature, of what man had been capable of. Looking at the stillness of his body made me uneasy. I felt there was something innate inside him, as if he would awake from his slumber and tear you limb from limb. I fell into deep rumination, imagining how the everyday man would react to such a sight. Would it create a paradox in their mind, feeling both pity and contempt for adhering to such contrarianism seemed laughable. By doing this, they reaffirm themselves in their insipid occupations, postulating their narrative of a presupposed world in which they find it easy to understand. Though, I suppose I was no better. Feeling as if it to contradict these feelings would be defying my existence, I left later that very night, feeling uncomfortable and afraid. An uncanny fear had clouded my sensibility. I remember feeling uneasy when returning to my apartment. I went to bed in order to be granted solitude from my night of turmoil. In the vilifying, tempestuous heat of the night, I had a feverish nightmare. In this state of quasi-lucidity, I recall a sense of imbalance. My gait, that of a drunkard. I found myself in a place unknown to me. An abysmal pocket deep below the earth. Interconnected cavities led deeper into the dark. Stalagmites lined the ceiling, with sharp stakes that threatened to impale me. I wandered aimlessly, guided by unchiseled pillars of mountain rock. I carefully maneuvered my way about the cave, as to avoid falling into the transient and perpetual darkness, lost in the absence of form. As I counted my steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, I heard it. Quick, heavy footsteps suddenly became audible, shaking the confines of the cave. I became paralyzed. I stood motionless, sitting and staring into the voracious black in a state of terror, fearing what dreaded creature so swiftly moved towards me. It was in that dreaded stupor that I ran. I stumbled and fell, colliding with pebbles and stones that further heightened my sense of urgency, anticipating and preparing to submit a fate surely worse than death. As I ran, the rocks seemed to protrude less and less, retreating back into their stone surfaces, as the walls of the cave moulded into a rounded form. I now found myself in an area more familiar to me, for it was purely the product of man. I listened. The footsteps were no more. Yet I felt no less uneasy. Before long, I had found myself knee-deep in a malodorous sewage tunnel. Large, cylindrical, and interconnected tunnels stretched indefinitely. Pipelines and brick laid the walls and the ceilings. The restless industrial maze that man had created. I recall feeling languid. My movements had become dulled. I felt the entrenchments of vile matter course through my blood, oppressing each step I took as I waded through what felt like tar. It was after I felt I had walked for eternities that I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Rejuvenated in that moment, I began to sprint toward the light. In that moment of the purest ecstasy, I had not realized that each step I took blackened the already murky waters, and that it now reached my waist. It crept up my body ever so slowly. Its aqueous claws threatened to subdue me in its turgid mightiness. As my feet left the ground in which I had been walking on, I began to swim with a fervent terror. I thrashed and struggled. Yet it was inevitable that I would sink, for I was but a germ in a colony of waste. I stopped fighting. Ceasing to move my limbs, I began to sink. I looked up in my idle state. The sight of the ceiling slowly diminished as I drifted deeper and deeper into its bottomless pit. I assumed the fetal position. I awoke from that tumultuous night in a dreary, panic state. I had never yet been pious, yet that night I was compelled to pray to God. Over the course of a few days, I had developed into a surreptitious insomniac. It began to trickle into my everyday life and inevitably would take a toll on my well-being. My thoughts would often stray to that very man, occupying my every thought. At home, I would see him barely perceptible outside of my peripheral vision, a towering, indefinable mass lurking, as if he awaited a moment of weakness, able to strike at any moment. Very soon, I had been let off work as I was deemed unfit to continue working. An inquiry was made into my mental well-being. Of course, nothing ever came of this. As for the most part, I kept to myself. The visions inched closer. Seldom did I sleep in the wake of madness, his imposing presence making itself known at every turn. One night, I got up to go to the bathroom. The warm, fluorescent light reflected off of the bathroom tiles, producing a sickly yellow that induced a sporific dreariness in me. I dared not look up at myself, for surely my harsh dealings with the woes of paranoia had transfigured me into a grotesque, caricature of myself. As I looked down, my gaze was met by the hideous countenance of a corpse. It had been him in that drain, that illusory fiend that appeared to me that rainy night, entombed within the confines of my bathroom drain. His eyes were now two sunken black holes. One felt that they could plunge into its depths. I screamed and bolted out of the room. I left my apartment and kept running, never looking back for a second. In that state of abject horror and adrenaline, I felt alleviated somehow. My earlier trepidations had formed into a hypnagogic elation, unsure if I was fully conscious, yet more alive than I had ever been in my waking hours. After running aimlessly that night, by some miracle of predestination, I had found myself in a peculiar place. I stood staring blankly into the vacuous mouth of the behemoth before me. The entrance to a large, cylindrical sewer tunnel opened its jaws, like that of a giant basking shark. It was my own foolishness that had led me to this place, for I secretly yearned for such. I obeyed my drives and entered the edifice of its inescapable bowels. I had found myself knee-deep in malodorous sewage tunnel. Large, cylindrical, and interconnected tunnels stretched indefinitely. Pipelines and brick layered the walls and ceilings. The restless industrial maze that man had created. I recall feeling languid. My movements had become dulled. I felt the entrenchments of vile matter course through my blood, oppressing each step I took as I waded through what felt like tar. This time, however, no light at the end of the tunnel appeared to me, only the same unflinching darkness, which doomed me to ruin. Escape seemed futile, for it pulled one further into its depths. I cannot even remember if there had even been an entrance, for an entrance would imply an exit, yet every pathway led into a different, desolate area of sewage, never bearing any possibility of escape. No hymn or prayer may save me now, as my soul is doomed to drift into a catatonic plight. My blood remains the only ink readily available to me. If we were to suppose that my mad writings were not lost, these bloodied parchments of mine will remain the remnants of a long time gone. No one will be able to hear the fervorous timbre of my voice, for these sewers have stripped me of every vocal cord I had, any fight I had in me. I implored the cretin that I met that day, for he unknowingly became my Mephistopheles, a deviant of callous trickery. I wonder how many of them reside under the earth as I do, oblivious to mankind, sheltered from the lunacy such evolved men would bring. I believe I have reached the end of my account, so I feel it is my duty to inform any such unfortunate reader who may have come across these ravings of mine. Please be wary of the caveman, for his archaic flame always burns anew, quoth his prey, lured into the depths of hellish futility.